Please help me welcome Muhyadeen and Alan.
This is the second time I've seen the film. I watched it a week or so ago, and I really like it. I think it's a great film. It's a great story, and I love the line towards the end where I think it's the New York Times sports reporter says, Ali is more about us than it is about him. It's our reaction to him that's the story as much as his own story. I think in many ways that's true, and part of that is because of the times that he lived in, and I lived in. The film is really about three things when you think about it. It's about race, it's about religion, and it's about resistance. It's about this black man who wants to be the heavyweight champion of the world. It's about this man who converts to Islam and what that transformation means in his life. And it's about a man who resists the draft and the government's desire to send him off to Vietnam with a gun and kill people. So I think in many ways those three themes were really important during the time that Ali was living, not just for him, but for a lot of people. So I really, as I was watching this film, I really was thinking as much about myself as I was about him, to be frank, in this odd sort of way. It's like he's almost holding up a mirror that we react to. The other thing I want to say is there's a lot of footage from 1968. And a few years ago, when I was working on a bill in the legislature for the ACLU, I was trying to understand why in 1968 the Vermont legislature would pass a bill that made it legal for police to go into any pharmacy in this state and look at anybody's pharmacy records. That's still actually enforced today, and every once in a while you hear about police without a warrant or a subpoena or anything like that going into a drugstore and asking for somebody's prescription drug records. And I kept thinking, how could it be that a law like this would be passed? I mean, now HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act, which provides some privacy protections, probably would not allow this law, or at least would make people think a lot harder about it before they passed it. So I went to the state law library where they keep old newspapers, and I pulled out the Rutland Heralds from the time when the Vermont legislature was meeting in 1968. And it was an amazing experience to look at front page after front page of the Rutland Herald from about January 1st up until the end of May. I mean, you cannot believe what the world looked like through the newspaper during those 4 and 5 months. Here in Vermont, the legislature was just totally stuck. They were totally divided. Phil Hoff was governor. I think it was his last year. The legislature had turned Republican, and all they could do was fight. On the pages of the Rutland Herald, Vietnam was just turning into this horrible mess. I think the Tet Offensive was that year. Draft resistance was getting much more pronounced. Resistance to the war demonstrations were getting bigger and bigger. Lyndon Johnson was first in the race for president, and then he was out. Then Eugene McCarthy, who had started as the challenger to Johnson, all of a sudden was the front runner, and then Robert Kennedy was mentioned as a candidate, and first he was in, then he was out, then he was in, and then a few months later he's shot. Martin Luther King was shot. Malcolm X was shot in 1968. I mean, it was just an incredibly tumultuous year. And remembering back on that, to have this overlay of Muhammad Ali and what he was going through, was just really, it was an incredible mirror to those times. So, I'll stop.
This movie touched, in my opinion, many subjects. Of course, obviously about race and racism in the United States. But for me, as a Muslim person, I would like, I don't know if you all know much about the Nation of Islam, the so-called Nation of Islam, and Elijah Muhammad. I feel that I have to clear that to everybody. He was no messenger, no prophet, no nothing. He appointed himself that, gave himself that position, and said that. Many things, like he said, was a sin integration. That's so completely, so much against Islam. Like, no way, no how. There's no race in Islam, no race. Anybody can be a Muslim. Whether you're white, black, red, whatever your color, skin color is, doesn't matter. But also we shouldn't deny that he did something good for the black community in the United States at that time. Even till now, what they do, they showed us in the movie about no drugs, for instance, no alcohol, which is really good, especially for in neighborhoods where they have the poor, you have the crimes and drugs and alcohol and all that stuff. So that was the good thing about the Nation of Islam. But I felt I have to clear that they call themselves the Nation of Islam, but they don't even pray in any masjid or so-called mosque, known as mosque. They don't pray, they don't come pray. They have their halls, like those temples, they call them, that you saw in the movie, and they are sitting on chairs in huge auditorium and listen. That's not part of Islam. I mean, that's not praying in Islam. I mean, yes, you can sit and listen to the leader, okay. I don't talk too much about that, but just thought I should clear that out to everybody. Muhammad Ali, I still remember I was a little kid. I was back home, Palestine, Israel, and the whole town had maybe 2 or 3 TVs, black and white. And everybody would go there to watch Muhammad Ali's game. I still remember that vividly. It just was wow. He definitely made people over the world look at the United States, the black in the United States and the African Americans in the United States, but especially Muslims. And at that time was a very well-known person, unlike boxers now, big deal, Unlike his time was completely different. He really, almost I think everybody loved him, and he contributed a little bit about towards Islam, or for people to really look at Islam maybe differently. So that's basically about Muhammad Ali, and there's the movie I also would like, Malcolm X, or Shabazz, he called himself afterwards. When he went to Mecca for pilgrimage, he found that Islam is not what Elijah Muhammad told him, and he was shocked when he was in pilgrimage and sitting next to a white man, blonde, blue eyes, from Europe, gave him bread, It's impossible. How could, like when he called him brother, it's like, whoa. So one should differentiate between Islam and Muslims also, because unfortunately Muslims nowadays are not really role models of Islam. I mean, so many Muslims do well, but so many good things, but also there are Muslims who do very bad things that are contradictory to Islam, and the media loved that. Oh, here's Islam, here's Muslims. And one should differentiate between the real Islam and Muslims or cultures and all that. That's all I want to say. If you have questions.
I actually had a question, if I could ask you. What you just said about the media, do you feel today that the media misportrays Muslims? I mean, continually the American media sort of plays on images.
I wish it only portrays it. The media from the fringe left all the way to the right are anonymously anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and anonymously. You find very few who are not Protestant, but like at least show reality of in the United States at least, but also in Europe as well. I mean, look at the media, whether it's so-called news media or the movies, how they portray Islam, how they show Islam or Muslims as basically subhumans or primitive or backward, and every time you see in the movie there are terrorists, must be Muslims. I still remember excuse me, I lived in Brooklyn, New York City before Vermont, and my mother used to love visit us, to go to museums or shows or stuff like that. And she came one day, she said, oh, I went to the movie theater, saw the movie Air Force One. I didn't even know what was it about. I said, oh, what's it? What is it? Oh, it's about, the president was hijacked and, and they're Muslims. I didn't see anything about that was my question to her. Either they're Palestinians or Muslims. Well, they were not Muslims exactly, but they were from those former Muslim states. Come on. They should just get a grip and start really shaping up and talking about Islam other than what they think and what they, There's a great book, I would say, quintessential book when it comes to the media on how they portray and look at Islam or Muslims. If you are interested in reading, it's by the late Edward Said. His book is Covering Islam, about how the media covers or talks about Islam and Muslims. That's like a great book, just an eye-opener. And if you really want to know about how the media think about us Muslims, about how we, the Muslims, think and see the world, that's your book too. But his trilogy, he published 23 books, he died. But his trilogy is Covering Islam, The Question of Palestine, and Orientalism. Orientalism also would be great to read with, as well as Covering Islam, because it shows how basically centuries old this understanding or Western or because it Occident understanding or knowledge about Islam and Muslims. The Orientalism is a really deep book. You have to really concentrate on it.
Start with Covering Islam, huh?
I'm curious about something you said, not directly on the topic, but the prescription drug. What prompted that law?
It was the supposed drug craze that had come to Vermont. There were all these stories about undercover drug agents who were trying to infiltrate the drug culture of UVM, the University of Vermont. And Patrick Leahy was actually a state's attorney at that time. And even he thought it was somewhat ridiculous. And so there was this feeling that Vermont had to do something. The legislature decided they were going to update the state's drug laws, which apparently hadn't been looked at since the 1920s. And so they did this big revamping of drug laws, and they included this provision that cops can go into any pharmacy without a warrant and get our records.
So that was part of a larger
Yeah. And I couldn't find any stories about people objecting to that particular provision. And like I say, the law's still in the books, and it gets used every once in a while, even now.
Many people don't know.
No, many people don't know, and it became a fight about 4 years ago when the state set up its electronic prescription monitoring system, the VPMS, Vermont Prescription Monitoring System, because the police wanted to have the same access to an aggregated electronic database of everybody's drug records as they have had to drugstore records. And the ACLU, really fought against that. And so far, we've been able to keep the cops away from that electronic aggregated database. But they would very much like to have, click of a mouse kind of access.
But you said that it's still, that law is still used. And what types of cases is it used?
There was a case, it was about 5 years ago, 2008, maybe 2009, where cops went into a couple of drugstores in Franklin County and asked to see records. They usually go in and only ask for records of an individual person, but this time they actually went in and asked for a dump of records. They asked for records, if I remember correctly, of everybody who had gotten a certain drug through a prescription during the month of September, let's say. And even the head of the state, these were state police drug investigators who did it, and even the head of the state police at the time said that's really going too far. That's not how we choose to use this power. But it does have, and it's any law enforcement officer has this power in the state. It's not just the state police. It's not just drug investigators. It's any
kind of
police.
good that somebody in law enforcement is choosing to be a little bit responsible about that. But it seems like at the time when they passed that law, probably, it sounds like there's plenty of other things to be protesting against and not worry about that law. And likewise today, there's plenty of things to find objectionable, and we're pulled in a million different directions to know what to fight against for our rights to be protected.
Yeah, unfortunately, the law was challenged in 1992. A case went to the Vermont Supreme Court, and the police won. It's a little bit of an odd case because it involved a nurse who was treating inmates, I believe, at the Rutland jail at the time, and she was essentially skimming some drugs when she was picking up orders at one of the pharmacies in Rutland. So it's got some odd circumstances, but the court found that it was proper for police to go to the pharmacy where she had been picking up orders and look at her prescription drug records.
That makes sense for that.
Well, this was pre-HIPAA. HIPAA was passed by the Congress in 1996. So we actually think the protections that we have under the federal HIPAA law would probably make the justices look at that case in a different way than they did back in '92. And we've been looking for another case where we could bring a challenge. It would be an interesting challenge to bring.
So I'm from Scotland, which is why it's interesting, even me communicating with our both accents. But I only knew Muhammad Ali's name, and knew what his face looked like, and I knew that he was a boxer, and that's all I knew. I didn't know he was Muslim. I didn't know anything about Nation of Islam. I never heard of it. And one of the things that I found really remarkable in watching this film, which I think is a very good film, I liked it very much, is how he went from being booed and nobody would let him fight to get given a medal. and it wasn't just for his sportsmanship, it was also for his, yeah. And I think that's quite fascinating. And I wondered if there was any comment on how that can happen over 30 years, probably. Why do you think that Muhammad Ali, the people came round? Because was it his personality? He's got an amazing personality, or yeah, just quite inspired by.
He's great. You know, I think like what I'm sorry, I forget both of your names.
Yeah, I'm Alan.
Alan, what Alan was saying about, you know, him being as much our perception of him as he was him.
Yeah.
I mean, it is so important. Like, and your name?
Muhyadeen.
Muhyadeen. Being a Palestinian in Israel, watching Muhammad Ali fight in the 60s. I mean, he must have had so much importance to Palestinians, like being, representing the resistance of the oppressed, right? Like he has so much meaning for so many people. And more as people mature and recognize how he represents the struggle for justice so deeply. Like and over time, of course, he's gotten bigger and bigger. He's more important all the time, and more important than he ever could have imagined he was. You know, I think that yeah, and it's such, you know, such people that inspire us to defend our rights, to defend, to stand up against an unjust moment in time in our lives. And you see that it worked out for him. It doesn't work out for everybody, but you know, he's pretty darn inspiring that, you know, he was actually charismatic and big enough at the time to make it work out for him. Like, holy, if we could just be that confident when we're standing up for our rights, that, you know, that we might just be able to make it, and we face that all the time. Like, you know, like how many things we have to object to and protest against, and how we're going to summon the energy to resist it. And it's a matter of that courage and confidence and outrage and indignity of the moment that you're facing, and at the time when you're facing it, that, you know, you summon up the emotion that you get from, you know, seeing this film for the first time about this guy, you know, who, you know, he was just a boy. He was really just a boy, and he had to ask people for advice and what do I do, and but, you know, and also it speaks to the, you know, the value of leadership in the community. And I'm glad, I'm sorry, I forgot your name once more. Muhyadeen. That you respect the value of Elijah Muhammad, the false prophet, but the value that he had for the community that he was leading, and the example that he set, and just, you know, the strength that Muhammad Ali got from him. I mean, all these things coming together that, you know, that create an opportunity. I mean, what Muhammad Ali meant to the civil rights movement. Holy smokes, to have this like big, like charismatic, loudmouth black man, you know, as champion of the world in a time when black people are wondering whether they should be cowed or whether they should stand up for their rights and go sit in at the Woolworths or go register to vote, or all these things are happening, and Muhammad Ali is showing them.
You know, the other part of the story about Ali involving the draft, I think, was somewhat incomplete. And when you were talking, I was thinking, I think that Ali deserves a lot more credit for his anti-war stance, which I think ultimately draft resistance in this country led to a realization the war in Vietnam had to end. I mean, when there were a lot of people resisting the draft by the late 60s and early 70s. And the only way that Richard Nixon was able to keep enough people in the Army was by coming up with the idea of having a lottery. And the brilliancy of the lottery was once your year passed, I think the lottery was when you were 18 years old, you were given a number. And if your number was relatively high, say 180 and above, it was pretty clear you were not going to get drafted. So all of a sudden, you didn't have to worry about getting drafted. So you didn't, you were sort of, you became complacent. You were sort of pushed to the side in your own mind because your life was really no longer threatened as it had been when you carried around a draft card with a 1A on it. That was the highest classification. So I think the legal case that is talked about, the one that went to the Supreme Court, is really interesting. It's true that it set absolutely no precedent, but it's an indication of how much the government was worried about the impact that Ali could have on other black Americans who would think, oh, I can do this too, I can avoid the draft. But also a lot of white Americans were also opposing the draft and were becoming bolder in claiming conscientious objector status.
It's also a sign of how court decisions really reflect the culture as well.
Yeah, I mean that one I think is an extreme example of that. It's they really reached to get out of that one because they wanted to make they made a political decision. They really didn't make. I mean, they did make a judicial decision.
Making a political decision.
Yeah.
There was something recent, I've forgotten what it was, but it seemed like it was more motivated because of public opinion than because of strict legal. And frankly, that's not the way the Supreme Court is supposed to work. Whether I agreed with their decision or not, it makes me worry a little bit about what's going on in our supposed democracy.
For me also, it was, I mean, I read a lot and also seen news clips about the civil rights and civil movement, all of that, and racism. But still, it was a shock for me to see how much they hated Muhammad Ali because of his resistance. He didn't want to go to the military, go to Vietnam. And of course I had no doubt because of also he didn't want. He changed his name to Muhammad Ali, wanted to become Muslim, so they basically wanted him to go there. But the way the reactions of, especially the first one on the TV show,
David Sussman.
Oh my God,
Wasn't that awful?
That was horrible.
But try being a celebrity nowadays and opposing the wars that we're in nowadays. Like, let alone being
Think of the Dixie Chicks, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There
Like,
we go.
I mean, it's worse now, actually. You know, people are so afraid they won't take a stand. They won't even, like, even not being drafted and not facing that, going to have to shoot somebody or get shot, just to give your opinion is frightening. We're in a scary time right now.
Yeah.
I also think, like you said, Alan, that Ali is sometimes underestimated for how smart he was and how he was able to manipulate the press. I think there's one point in the movie where later, I think he was on the David Frost show, and he was saying, I believe that, white men are evil. That's what, I believe it. That's my faith. And later on, when he was older, he said, he was asked about that by another reporter. He said, "Oh well, those were the days. Weren't they?" He was very aware, I think, often what he was doing with the media. I was in a room with Ali. It was about half the size of this room in 1974. He was going to be fighting a white guy, Chuck Wepner. Is that who it was in '74?
Was he German?
No.
He was an
He
American.
was an American white guy. He had no chance to win, but
But he needed the money, and that's why Ali agreed to fight him.
yeah.
And where was this?
This was in the green room of the Mike Douglas TV show.
in Philadelphia or New York?
I think it was Philadelphia.
Yeah, I think Douglas was out of Philadelphia.
Yeah, so Ali was one of the guests on the show. I was sitting in the green room, and here comes the champ, you know. So I jumped up, I said, it's the champ. And I went to get my friends who were in another dressing room. And the point of my story is Chuck Wepner was sitting off in the corner like this, you know, really trying to be invisible. Ali came into the room and started shadow boxing with Wepner. You know, how fast he was, trying to get something out of him. Wepner was just trying to ignore him. And Ali was just shouting at him, getting back and forth. And somebody made the comment when he was being interviewed by Mike Douglas. Is there something you have, Ali, against white men? Is that why you're insulting Chuck Wepner? Because, you know, he's a white guy? And it missed the whole point. Ali was trying to get some excitement for the interview on TV, and which is why he was trying to goad this white guy there. So Ali again was manipulating the situation because he was in control of the situation.
And that's the white guy actually thinking more of himself than he is actually seeing what Ali is doing.
Yeah, and the white guy didn't want to play Ali's game.
Yeah,
He was
exactly.
just, you know,
Yeah.
trying to.
Yeah, yeah.
I think Ali was really, really smarter than a lot of people gave him credit for in those days.
And then in the end, to see him with Parkinson,
Yeah.
with Parkinson's
so sad.
disease, is just so sad.
I had a question, Alan, actually. Do you know how does the court have jurisdiction to decide if someone is sincere or not? I mean, that's about feeling. That's dealing with someone's internal feelings about something.
Right, but if you notice, that really wasn't the issue. The issue was, at one point, the government said that they thought he wasn't being sincere, and at another point they said he was being sincere. And it was the inconsistency between those two things that was the small hook that Potter Stewart found that said that's a denial of due process.
Okay, so the second part is then, if someone's exercising their right to be a conscientious objector, how does the government then have the power to deny that right? I don't know when the right of conscientious objection was established. It's not a constitutional right, but it's
all through
considered a right.
Yes, it's all through case law, and most of the case law is based on the First Amendment, your religious freedom right. And historically, your right to refuse conscription was based on a personal religious conviction that you felt you could not kill, that it was immoral to kill. So the first test was to convince whoever was hearing your case. You submitted an application, and then your draft board made a determination, and if you disagreed with the determination, I think there was one more administrative appeal, then it went to the courts. But the first hurdle was to convince the hearing officer or judge that you were a religious person and that your resistance was based on a strongly held religious belief. Then if you passed that hurdle, you also had the trouble that Ali was having, which was the perception that he was opposed to this war but may not be opposed to other wars. And for the longest time, that was something that prevented many people from not getting CO status during the Vietnam War. But it's all from case law based on the First Amendment is where the right comes from.
Is the conscientious objection right still based on affiliation with a religious belief, or can it be somebody who's agnostic or atheist?
There haven't been cases for so many years because once the draft disappeared, there's no longer conscription.
Whether the law would still require...
It's an interesting question. I mean, the First Amendment protects your religious freedom right. So the question you're really asking is would agnosticism be thought of as a religion and a right to believe in no religion as strong as believing in a religion
So you don't
would be.
remember any cases where people who had no religious beliefs successfully claimed conscientious objection?
I don't have a memory of it.
Right.
But you know, that still comes up now, not in conscientious objection cases, but it came up last year in the vaccine discussions, the mandatory vaccine, where the legislature wanted to expand the mandatory vaccine programs for kids because there were waves of certain epidemics, as the health department said, that were starting to ripple through the state, and they wanted to try and stop those. And there is a I think it's not called a religious exemption. There's a philosophic exemption that you're allowed if you are philosophically opposed to vaccines. You can refuse, and the state cannot require you to get the vaccine. And the requirement comes that for many kids, you have to be vaccinated before you can enroll in school. You know, you have to have all your shots before you're accepted at kindergarten, kind of thing. And the question is, if somebody refuses to be vaccinated, can they still enroll in a public school? And there was a big debate, I think 2 years ago, about whether anything other than a religious or even something other than a philosophic exemption would be allowed. Could you simply say no because you were opposed to it on intellectual grounds? I mean, what does it really mean to be philosophically opposed?
Alan, I don't know if you can address this issue, but one of the things that I found so very intriguing about this film is that this all kind of takes place within the same time the civil rights movement was taking place. But there were a whole host of groups within civil rights, and so much of that movement involved religious leaders of all denominations, and white people and a whole host of different folks. And it kind of seems like, I'm from Chicago, and the Nation of Islam was a very fringe group at that time, and has remained. I've never seen Louis Farrakhan be so rational as I've seen him in this film. But the tensions between the different movements were taking place where Martin Luther King, trying to embrace, they're doing good things, they're showing great courage, regardless of what you think of their religion. I don't know if you can kind of address anything to that.
Well, there's that one scene in the film where Muhammad Ali and King are together, and they're trying to say how they're both working on the same things, and Muhammad puts his arm around his shoulder, and Martin Luther King looks like the most uncomfortable person in the world when that's happening, you know? It's like, do I want this guy to be doing this to me in film and all that kind of stuff?
Well, and J.F. Hoover was trying to accuse him of being a communist.
Right.
Painting him with red brush.
You know, Martin Luther King's later years are really interesting because he came out strongly against the Vietnam War, which caused a big break between him and the Johnson administration. And Johnson had been courting King and the black vote largely through his political economic programs, the war on poverty. And that was used as a way of trying to get black people to be involved in domestic issues and not become opposed to the Vietnam War. And when King made his famous speech at Riverside Cathedral in New York, and when was that, 67, I think?
64, 1967.
It was 67. It was a really huge shift that probably, that's another one of those turning points that probably made it impossible for Johnson to continue as president and for the war in Vietnam to continue. So there were a lot of tensions in there, and religion pops up as an important undercurrent of causing people to make decisions that I think had a really big impact. And I think for King, the opposition to the war in Vietnam was a very religiously based belief. He was a faith-driven person, that's for sure.
I would say even from 72 to present, Nation of Islam in Chicago is still very fringe. There would be one leader in the black community in Chicago, Reverend Jackson. And so it's kind of interesting. This is almost a film kind of giving history and some explanation
Yeah.
to Nation of Islam,
Yeah.
with Muhammad Ali set kind of in the center of it.
So whatever happened to Malcolm X's followers in New York City? Do they still have a
I don't know much about him actually. I mean, I lived in New York State before Vermont. I went to his masjid or mosque, Michael Shabazz Mosque, called in Harlem. Actually.
That's in Harlem.
I prayed there too, but there's much of a movement as far as I know.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I don't know much about them. Actually, one time I met with the imam of that masjid, and he seemed like anyone else, any other imam, or just talking about Islam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you each maybe have a takeaway about the film? Do you each have maybe a takeaway message that the film presents that you've just seen, for people to go home with?
Well, you know what? I think for me it made me think again about how I view Muhammad Ali, because I remember when he was this loudmouth black man who changed his name and started flirting with this weird religion. And I think for a kid, for the age I was at, it was he was a difficult guy to understand. I mean, he was an interesting role model, and I'm glad the film shows a wide sweep of his life and the things that he was involved with. And again, those three themes of race, religion, and resistance, for me, were just really, really important and really powerful. And I have an incredible amount of respect for the man. He's an amazing figure.
I'm glad I got to watch this movie actually, because I learned a lot more about Muhammad Ali, and even more about a little bit about the 60s and 70s in the United States and the racism and all that. It made me, I was a bit sad. I was sad that the way he would, like we just said before, that he's now can barely talk, such a big person like Muhammad Ali. But also it maybe shed a little bit of light about Islam versus media. Not a whole lot, but just a little bit. And I definitely would like people to really dig into like a little bit about Islam, try to find out the realities about Islam. And you shouldn't believe the media or the so-called news media, even the other media. Just we're being labeled, please just use your mind, use your head, and interact with Muslims instead of just listening to the media and what they say and all that claim about us. Definitely we're not role models, of Islam, unfortunately, unlike the first Muslims in the first few centuries of Islam. So therefore it shouldn't, look at the behaviors of some Muslims and say that's Islam. This, actually, one thing in the movie, when they said, when they showed that the nation of Islam showed Christianity enslaving blacks. No, Christians not Christianity. Christianity was not. Jesus, peace upon him, will never allow such things happen in this country. Are still happening against blacks or anybody, basically. Same thing goes for Islam.
Let me just remark on one more thing, and I didn't it didn't strike me the way it did this second time when I watched the film. In the very beginning, where Cassius Clay is this up and coming fighter, and the group of people in Louisville, Kentucky, are his supporters, and I didn't realize, but the man who's still alive and was interviewed about the relationship they had with Ali starts the conversation by saying, "I'm part of the group of people who owned Cassius Clay." And you know, that's, how many times do you hear somebody, especially a white person, actually saying that? The idea you can own a person, you know? And I hope he was just thinking as a businessman, and Ali, it was the Ali franchise, and what he really meant was, we own the Cassius Clay franchise. But he simply said, we own Cassius Clay.
That's not necessarily racist. I mean,
I hope
not your own Frank Sinatra, as far as we know.
Yeah.
And I think they use the same terminology.
Yeah. That's what I want to believe. So, but it just really struck me.
Well, I think it's incredible too, the conviction of ideas and the willingness to make such great sacrifices. You saw in the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King, John Lewis going into communities and getting beaten because they were willing to stand up for an idea. And Muhammad Ali doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Giving up his title that meant so very much to him. Possibly going to jail for 5 years, giving up $10 million. Just that conviction, and to stand for your convictions. It's really
He's an
impressive.
amazing guy. Still is.
Thank you very much.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.